Hi, I'm Femi Okay.
And I'm Malika Bilal, and you're in the stream.
Today, in the Philippines, what's the human cost of President Rodrigo Duterte's drug war? We discuss allegations of human rights abuses and what's being done about them.
Are you personally impacted by the Philippine war on drugs? We want to hear what you have to say on this issue. Let us know via Twitter or in our live YouTube chat.
I'm Inday Espina Varona, a journalist, advocate for women's rights, and you are in the stream.
Thousands of crime suspects have been killed in Philippine President Rodrigo Duterte's war on drugs over the past 3 years. But rights groups believe the number of casualties is much higher than the 6,000 some deaths the government admits to. Amnesty International says the killings disproportionately affect poor communities and amount to crimes against humanity. Last week, the UN Human Rights Council voted to investigate alleged abuses in the country. Those abuses include extrajudicial killings, disappearances, and police cover-ups. Authorities say those killed were crime suspects who were armed and resisting arrest. The Philippines Human Rights Commission says there could be more than 27,000 deaths from extrajudicial killings. The government denies that figure and supports instead a strong anti-drug campaign, and they say that it's necessary to reduce crime.
So in this episode, we'll learn about the people impacted by Duterte's policies and ask whether the nation's approach towards fighting drug crime needs reform. Well, with us to discuss this in Manila, Carlos Conde, a researcher with Human Rights Watch. Also in Manila, Lucio Blanco Pitlo, a political and security analyst with the think tank Asia Pacific Pathways to Progress. And in Hong Kong, Al Jazeera correspondent Jamela Alindogan. We reached out to the government for a representative to join our program as well, but they declined our request. So welcome to all of you. And I want to start with our community because at the top of the show, we asked people for their experiences if they've been impacted by this war on drugs. We heard responses. So this is Eni Al Tupas, who writes on Twitter, "If it had not been for Duterte's drug war, my brother would have been a drug addict until now." He goes on to say, "My brother was fairly incarcerated by authorities. There are also reported cases of killings here in our place where we are due to the administration's anti-drug campaign. And that's because some drug addicts have illegal possessions of firearms, which give the police the right to protect their lives." So a viewpoint, Jamela, that may not hear often, at least outside of the Philippines. What do you make of his take on this drug war? Because he seems to think it's a success.
Well, it's hard to make judgment of his personal experience, but just based on my experience as someone who's covered the drug war from the very beginning, I'd like to say that it's very hard to measure the sentiment of people when they live in a climate of fear. It was obvious from the very beginning there was always an issue of security, safety, physical security in so many neighborhoods across the country. This is why when the president promised during the campaign, and we've covered the campaign quite extensively, his campaign in particular, I produced a documentary on President Duterte's presidential campaign and another documentary of his first 100 days. He promised to end the presence of illegal drugs, narcotics, within the first 6 months of his office. So this campaign, this presidential campaign promise, is actually really essentially what propelled him to power and really what got him the presidency. I guess a year after he sat in office, he kind of admitted that he's not going to be able to fulfill that promise. And more than 2 years on, as the drug war continues, so-called drug war continues, he himself admits that he's not going to be able to stop the presence of illegal drugs here. So yes, there are so many people who feel that their lives have been transformed positively by the war on drugs. But from my experience, I have also been witness to so many families who have also suffered because of, the kind of the loss that they've had, losing somebody they love, somebody they knew because of the so-called war on drugs. So there are many different narratives, but it's hard to determine that when everybody lives under this climate of fear and 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 so it's we have to respect that a lot of people do feel the similar, but from my experience also covering the war on drugs, that's kind of a minority perspective.
Carlos, I hear you just about to get in there. Let me just play somebody who started off supporting the war of drugs. She's from the Philippines, and then she had a tragedy in her own family, and then she changed her mind. Have a listen to her first, and then Carlos, you pick up off the back of that.
I was even saying that the tears of the families of those killed seemed fake. But when it happened to us, I felt the pain they were feeling, which we were now experiencing. Back then, I was really supportive of what was happening in the drug war. If it doesn't happen to your family, you won't wake up to the truth.
Carlos, go ahead.
Yeah, that's something that I think that sentiment is something that we're seeing increasingly happening in the Philippines because of the impact of the drug war. And just to go back to what Jamela has said about the effect of the killings on the family, I mean, this is something that us researcher for Human Rights Watch have been spending considerable amount of time on, trying to determine how the killings, the violence have affected children, particularly in poor families. And so far, what I've seen from doing this, and of course there are others who are doing this, and particularly journalists as well. But what I've seen is that it's just an unbearable, thing to watch, to hear them recount what happened to them, witnessing the killing of their father or their brother, and more importantly, what happens afterwards, which is that a lot of them have lost livelihood. A lot of the children have stopped going to school. A lot of them basically just started working, and some of them, and a lot of them, started living on the streets, in the streets, because no one could take care of them anymore. So, this drug war, while it may seem justifiable to a lot of Filipinos because of the many intractable problems that we've been facing for decades now, but this drug war has resulted in a catastrophic. It has damaged a generation of Filipinos, I think, and particularly the poor ones.
So you said particularly the poor one, and that is exactly where our community is picking up on. So Gio here on Twitter says, it's not really the poor paying the highest price, but rather only the poor paying the price. Bigger drug lords are still free to roam around while the poor become collateral. I wrote an essay for this for my human rights class last week. He writes in, Duterte is becoming Milosevic. So there's an extreme example right there, an extreme analogy that he's making right there that I don't think all of our people in our community would agree with. But the point he's making about who this affects, Lucio, what do you make of that point, that this is mostly and mainly affecting the poor?
Sure. The drug war is a very interesting campaign launched by the government. Opinion polls show sustained public support for the drug war. Since 2017, 9 out of 10 Filipinos argue that the drug war is actually, they are in support of it. In 2018, there was 78% satisfaction rating for the conduct of the drug war. Recently, in the midterm elections, you have the face of the drug war, former police chief Ronald Bato de la Rosa, winning 5th spot in the contest for senatorial balls, despite having no credible lawmaking credentials. And Duterte's recent approval rating remained high. Actually, surprisingly, even in classes D and E, the poorest of the poor, who were, as described, were among the demographics that suffered the most from the drug war. So,
but Professor, if I may, sorry to cut you there, but really, we need to, I think, disabuse the minds of a lot of people that this extreme popularity of a president is a justification or justifies or excuses the thousands and thousands of murders that we're seeing. I mean, no one is disputing that he is popular. He is extremely popular because Filipinos have grown sick and tired of the old ways of doing politics in the country, and he presented himself as the solution to many of our problems, not just on the drugs, but to confuse that popularity as a widespread support and worse, an endorsement or a justification for the drug war, I think is just extremely inaccurate, and I think that's just not, it just flies in the face of the many of sufferings of the people that we're seeing.
I want to bring.
No, I'm not in any way endorsing or justifying his popularity for the excesses and the abuses of the campaign. Things like those really marred the campaign, and I actually look forward that the campaign in the next 3 years will actually move towards the health and the rehabilitative aspect of the campaign, and probably try to make the campaign more humane and try to rein in
Yeah.
and discipline the excesses of police and law enforcement behind the anti-illegal drug operations.
All right, so gentlemen,
Actually, in the survey,
and Jamila, if I may,
there-
I just want to push you along a little bit, because the numbers, even though they're disputed for the number of civilian deaths, these are the numbers and the instances of human rights alleged abuses, as what made the UN Human Rights Council say we need to be investigating what is happening in the Philippines on the war on drugs. Jamila, do you want to take us into what exactly are they able to do, if anything?
Well, I'll leave that up to Carlos, who has been part of, who's been closely following the UN human rights deliberations over the past few months. But what I can just say, when we speak of the popularity of the president, so many surveys in the past actually do say that the general Filipino public do approve of the need for the campaign against drugs. However, not everybody and majority of them do not agree with the killings that have been committed by police. And that majority of those who have been surveyed do feel that they may be a victim to extrajudicial killings. So that's quite telling. When we speak of popularity, when we speak of surveys, we need to do and look into the context of the questions and the kind of answers that were given by those who have been surveyed. I just wanted to add to that. Based on my coverage of the government's reaction of, foreign international organizations coming in to investigate, they have always been dismissive of organizations coming in to investigate. Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, perhaps the EU. They've always said that this is basically interference, and that much is being done to prosecute those people or government officials in question. So I think that reaction, when that UN Human Rights Council decision came out, and the reaction of the government was quite expected. They were dismissive, and they were even actually contemplating on cutting diplomatic ties with Iceland. I mean, that was a statement released yesterday by the government spokesperson.
I would tackle.
We just got this comment live, and I hear you there, Carlos. So I'll give this to you because we just got this comment in live on YouTube. This is Guadalupe Flores, who says polls are easy to manipulate, and this is picking up on the point that you were making with Lucio about opinion polls and support and popularity. Guadalupe says they're easy to manipulate, especially in a country that doesn't have strong election systems. The question is whether or not Filipinos believe drug use and addiction has gone down with this. What do we know about drug use and addiction?
Well, if you listen to the government themselves, they're contradicting themselves basically, because they're saying that drug use in the Philippines remains the same, and in fact, they're saying that it has the problem with illegal drugs, and President Duterte himself said this has actually worsened. So, it's kind of a conundrum to many of us. But just to go back to the popularity before I tackle the UN Human Rights Council resolution. Keep in mind that the government has exploited and misused and used to the hilt this issue about the popularity of the president as if to excuse everything that has happened in this country. And you hear that a lot of times in many of your conversations, in many of my conversations with people with members of the international community. But just on the HRC resolution, I think this is a very crucial step. This is a small step, but very crucial step for accountability, as we've been saying, because the domestic human rights accountability mechanisms have not been working, regardless of what you hear from the government. It's not been working, and that's precisely why the UN Human Rights Council need to act. Now, what will happen after this? I mean, we will leave it to the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, Michelle Bachelet, to do what is necessary or what she thinks she could do. But, I mean, the UN Human Rights Council does not lack for options on how to determine the situation on the ground. So they will they will do that, and they will by the next session in June 2020. They are expected to put, to submit a report to the council and to see whether future significant actions can be taken in moving forward.
And this request for action doesn't just come from outside of the Philippines, it comes from inside of the Philippines. Have a listen to one woman, one activist who spoke to Jamila earlier on in July. Have a look.
More than 2 years ago in Manila, Nanette Castillo's son Algin was killed by armed men. But she believes they were linked to the police. Nanette blames President Rodrigo Duterte's so-called war on drugs for her son's death. And she's become an activist, speaking out against the campaign.
Sana mahinto na ang patayan.
Extrajudicial killings should end. The government should instead serve the Filipinos.
According to government data, more than 6,000 people have been killed over the past 3 years, an average of 6 every day.
So, Lucio, there you hear Jamila's reporting, and you can see from within the Philippines, it's not just outsiders who are upset with the number of civilians who are dying, but it's people within the Philippines. How do you make sense of that? Because I know earlier you were talking about the popularity of the president, but you also have activists saying this war on drugs, it has to stop.
Sure. The drug war, as I said earlier, has become a divisive issue domestically also. Even the death toll has been a contested figure. Government is saying that it's in the vicinity of 6,000. Rights groups are saying it's over 20,000. The police were saying they oppose lumping those killed in legitimate anti-drug operations with those deaths or homicides under investigation.
So, Lucia, though, if I'm just really very direct then, there are too many civilians who are dying. There's a little girl, the youngest, that we believe to have been caught up in a drug raid. We're going to show pictures of her funeral here. She was 3 years old, caught up in a drug raid. There was a teenager who again was caught up in a raid as well. We'll show pictures of his funeral. So we can debate the stats, but there are civilians and innocents who are dying. What do you do about that within the Philippines? What should the president do about that?
Well, sure. There are collateral damages to the campaign, and I think government should try to reassure the public that moving forward, this campaign, if it has to remain with this level of support, then it has to reassure the public that such incidents will be mitigated, and those involved in such shooting incidents, if they were found to did it so purposely, then they have to be prosecuted. If we will recall, some policemen involved in the killing of minors in Caloocan were brought to justice, and people really demanded for that, and the family of the victim got the justice that they deserve. So I think alongside the campaign to root out illegal drugs in the country is internal cleansing within the PNP ranks, in a quote-unquote internal cleansing. So the police understand that there are police officers involved in the drug trade, and this complicates the execution of the drug campaign. So I think government should demonstrate serious efforts to actually weed out these elements and
I
bring
think,
them to
Professor,
justice.
we've gone beyond. I think right now we've gone beyond internal cleansing. I think the PNP has demonstrated its unwillingness and its incapacity to investigate itself. I think right now with all these deaths, I think asking the police to mitigate the drug war, asking the government to deal with this collateral damage is, I think, a very low ask. What we're asking right now, what human rights defenders want, what the victims want, is accountability. There has to be a serious demonstration of accountability. And this, that case about the 17-year-old that resulted in the conviction of 3 police officers, that's just one case out of the thousands and thousands of cases that have been documented since 2016. Now, that is not at all, it doesn't at all give us comfort that accountability is coming. So, and the government itself, the Philippine National Police, they have all been trying to frustrate every attempt to investigate and to put, to ensure accountability domestically. So I think at this point, the Philippine government, the Philippine National Police, the Department of Justice, they have demonstrated an unwillingness to really exact accountability from the perpetrators of these killings. And we're just talking about the killings by the police.
Okay, so let me just say that the PNP, I guess if we mentioned the PNP as an acronym, it's the Philippines National Police. Malika.
So I wanted to share two takes on this. This first one is from Ramon on Twitter, who says that this anti-drug campaign, the so-called drug war, has produced results with the surrender of, he gives a number here, of 1 million drug dependents. Of course, we can't independently verify that. He says the difference, though, can be felt in communities where petty crimes were rampant before the crackdown. The depressed area in the city where I reside had drugs being sold openly in the streets before this. So that's one take on this. But on the opposite side of this spectrum, from someone who says reform needs to happen, is RJ. And he says the UN Human Rights Council's adoption of this resolution on this drug war campaign is an initial step to bring justice to thousands of deaths since he came to power. The pressure from the international community and the call for the protection of human rights in the course of the government's blatant disrespect brings the situation in the court of public opinion. Jamila, I'll bring you back in here because he mentions public opinion. What do you think public opinion is of this UN investigation, and especially given that the president has already said that, he is against it?
Well, it's hard to say exactly yet. It's too early to basically figure out what is public opinion of this, because I think it just came out about less than 2 weeks ago. But, if we're looking at a situation where people have basically been reading up every day and watching everyday news about the drug war, and we see basically that majority of people are busy with the very basics, having to, find food on the table, jobs. The concept of, fundamental freedoms, basic freedoms, human rights, these concepts are abstract in many ways. This is when government agencies do come in and need to come in to perform their duties. And this is where, like Carlos believes, and all other NGOs believe, where the government failed to act. I mean, you cannot expect the public to be the one to react and give the kind of opinion when it comes to issues like this, because there is a need for institutions to function properly, to support and protect the public. And I think this is what is the basis, basically, of the UN investigation. They said Philippine government has failed to act, and this is why we need to come in and investigate. And it's important to remember that this is not the only international court possibly investigating President Rodrigo Duterte's war on drugs. The International Criminal Court is also looking at the probability of a case, if there is any merit of possible crimes against humanity committed. There have been more than 50 communications submitted by different civil society groups to the International Criminal Court. So that's also something that needs to be watched out for. And also on the local level, the Supreme Court has already ordered the PNP to submit thousands and thousands of police reports that need to submit to the Supreme Court as part of its investigation. But from what I know, and please correct me if I'm wrong, this has not been submitted yet by the Philippine National Police.
Jamila, if I may, because you brought this up, it's difficult to know where are we in the war on drugs in terms of stats. And there's a report that came out just this month. It's from the Armed Conflict Location and Event Data Project. Just have a look so we can really crystallize. What are we talking about? Lucia called this collateral damage. I call this people dying. We have drug suspects account for almost 75% of civilian deaths. 18% of fatalities in the Philippines are former or current government officials. And then this last statistic, it's so illuminating that the state forces are responsible for about 60% of civilian targeted events. That means attacks or raids. But the 40% are also vigilantes, which gives you an idea of what it might be like to live in the Philippines in 2019. Carlos, Lucio, Jamila, I'm sure this will not be the last time we talk about the war on drugs in the Philippines. Thank you for helping us do that today. We appreciate your time. Malika and I will see you online. Take care, everybody.